The bamboo cage measured 4 feet by 4 feet. Paul Ramsey could not stand. He could not fully extend his legs. He could barely turn without his shoulders scraping against the rough-hewn slats that held him like cargo. It was August 1944, somewhere in the Philippine Islands. The Japanese guards considered him processed, catalogued, finished. They had taken his flight suit, his boots. His name, as far as they were concerned, no longer mattered. But Paul Ramsey was still thinking. And in the Pacific, that distinction separated those who returned home from those who never did. The camp sat in a clearing hacked out of jungle so dense that sunlight reached the ground only in narrow, shifting columns. Humidity pressed against everything. The air itself felt heavy, saturated with moisture and rot and the constant low hum of insects that never seemed to rest. Ramsey had been moved 3 times since his capture. Each transfer brought worse conditions. Each interrogation revealed less about him and more about how little the Japanese expected from their prisoners in these final months of the war. He was one of perhaps 24 American aviators held in this particular facility. Most were Navy, a few were Army Air Forces. All of them had fallen from the sky somewhere over the Philippine archipelago or the surrounding waters, plucked from life rafts, beaches, or the wreckage of their aircraft. The guards operated with a routine that never varied. Morning count, a small ration of rice, sometimes with vegetables so wilted they had lost all color. Work details for those strong enough to stand. Evening count, darkness. Escape, by any rational measure, was impossible. The jungle itself formed the first barrier. Miles of dense undergrowth, venomous snakes, disease-carrying mosquitoes, and terrain so disorienting that even local guides sometimes lost their way. Beyond the jungle lay Japanese-controlled territory extending in every direction. The nearest American forces were hundreds of miles away, across open water. The guards carried rifles. They had orders regarding prisoners who attempted to flee. Those orders, Ramsey understood, did not involve recapture. He had seen what happened to men who tried. 2 weeks before his arrival, an Army pilot had made a break during a work detail. He got perhaps 50 yards before the guards caught him. They brought him back to the camp. What followed took 3 days. The other prisoners were made to watch. So Ramsey did not think about escape. Not in those terms. He thought instead about survival, about maintaining enough strength to stand, about keeping his mind occupied with problems that had solutions. He calculated distances. He recalled navigation procedures. He mentally rebuilt aircraft systems, tracing fuel lines and hydraulic circuits through cockpits he might never see again. And he watched. Everything. The guards' patterns, the timing of supply deliveries, the subtle changes in routine that might mean something or might mean nothing at all. The Japanese captors saw a broken pilot in a bamboo cage. They saw compliance, resignation, another American aviator waiting for death or liberation, whichever came first. They did not see what Ramsey was actually doing. They could not have understood it even if they had. Like and subscribe if you believe these stories deserve to be remembered. Paul Henry Ramsey came from Missouri, the middle of America, the kind of place where the horizon stretched flat and endless, and the sky seemed bigger than anywhere else on Earth. He was born in 1919, the year the first transatlantic flight captured the world's imagination. By the time he was old enough to understand what that meant, aviation had transformed from novelty into necessity. Airplanes were no longer curiosities. They were the future. His father worked for the railroad. Steady work, respectable. The kind of career that kept a family fed through the Depression years when so many others went hungry. But Paul watched the sky more than he watched the trains. There was a grass airstrip outside town. Local pilots used it for crop dusting, mail runs, the occasional joyride for anyone with $1 to spare. Paul spent hours there as a boy, watching the fabric-covered biplanes take off and land, memorizing their movements, the way they climbed and banked and settled back to Earth. He understood even then that flight was not magic. It was mathematics, physics, the careful management of forces that wanted to pull you down and forces that could lift you up if you handled them correctly. He enlisted in the Naval Aviation cadet program in 1941. The timing was not accidental. War was coming. Everyone knew it. The only question was when and where it would find them. Primary training at NAS Jacksonville. Basic flying in the N3N biplane, the Yellow Peril, so named for its bright paint scheme, and its tendency to punish student mistakes without mercy. Advanced training followed. Instrument procedures, navigation, formation flying, carrier qualification. The carrier landings separated those who could fly from those who could land on a moving postage stamp in the middle of the ocean. The deck seemed impossibly small from the air. The approach required precision measured in inches. A hook that missed the arresting wire meant a barrier crash or a swim in the Pacific. Ramsey qualified on his first attempt. His instructors noted his temperament in their evaluations. Calm under pressure, methodical, not flashy, not aggressive, but reliable in ways that mattered more than natural talent alone. He was assigned to a fighter squadron operating from escort carriers in the Pacific. The aircraft he flew was the FM-2 Wildcat, a variant of the famous Grumman fighter modified for operation from the smaller carrier decks. It was not the most advanced fighter in the American inventory. The Hellcat and Corsair both outperformed it in speed and climb rate. But the FM-2 was rugged, reliable. It could take damage that would have destroyed lighter aircraft and still bring its pilot home. The engine was air-cooled, simpler to maintain in the field, less vulnerable to a single lucky hit. The landing gear was built to absorb the punishment of carrier operations. Ramsey flew combat patrols over convoy routes, hunting submarines and providing air cover for the slow-moving supply, ships that kept the Pacific campaign alive. It was not glamorous work. No one made ace flying escort missions, but the Navy needed pilots who could do the job day after day, in any weather, without making the kind of mistakes that got wingmen killed. He had logged nearly 200 hours of combat time before the mission that changed everything. The traits that would matter later were already in place. Patience, observation, the ability to remain functional when circumstances exceeded anything training had prepared him for. He did not know, in those early months of 1944, that these traits would save his life. He only knew that the sky demanded everything you had, and sometimes it demanded more. The mission was routine. They all were, until they weren't. June 1944. The Philippine Sea. American carriers were pushing westward, supporting operations that would eventually lead to the liberation of the Philippines. Ramsey's escort carrier was providing air cover for a logistics convoy moving supplies toward the forward bases. The morning launched normally. Ramsey climbed into his Wildcat in the pre-dawn darkness, ran through his checklist by the dim glow of his instrument panel, and waited for the signal to launch. The deck crew moved with practiced efficiency, positioning aircraft, checking tie-downs, clearing the path to the catapult. The launch threw him forward with the familiar violence of compressed steam and physics. One moment he was stationary. The next he was airborne, climbing away from the carrier's wake, joining formation with his section leader. The patrol pattern took them in a wide arc around the convoy. Below, the cargo ships and their escorts moved in disciplined columns, their wakes tracing parallel lines across the ocean surface. Above, scattered clouds provided cover that worked both ways. They had been flying for perhaps 3 hours when the radio crackled with contact reports. Japanese aircraft, bearing northwest, closing on the convoy at high altitude. Ramsey's section leader acknowledged and began climbing toward the reported contacts. Ramsey followed, pushing his throttle forward, watching his altimeter wind upward. The Wildcat responded sluggishly at first, then found its stride as the supercharger engaged and compressed air flooded the engine. What happened next occurred faster than memory could properly sequence. They encountered the Japanese formation at approximately 14,000 feet, zeros, mostly, with some other types mixed in. The numbers were unclear. In combat, they always were. Ramsey recalled later that there seemed to be a lot of them. The engagement became a swirling chaos of diving aircraft and tracer rounds and split-second decisions. Ramsey stayed with his section leader through the first pass, then lost visual contact during a sharp defensive turn. After that, he was alone. A Zero came at him from his right quarter. He saw the muzzle flashes before he heard the impacts. Something struck his engine cowling. Something else punched through the fuselage behind his seat. Oil spray began coating his windscreen. He returned fire, but his tracers seemed to pass behind the enemy aircraft. The Zero banked away, then came back for another pass. His engine began to run rough. The oil pressure gauge dropped toward 0. He knew what that meant. The Pratt & Whitney radial could run for perhaps minutes without oil before it seized. He dove for the clouds, using altitude as currency, trading height for distance from the fight. The clouds swallowed him in gray moisture. For a few seconds, he was invisible. When he emerged below the cloud layer, he was alone. No Japanese aircraft in sight, no friendly aircraft either. Just ocean in every direction, stretching to horizons he could no longer confidently identify. His engine temperature was climbing. The oil pressure was gone. He had perhaps 10 minutes of flight time before the engine failed completely. He spotted land, an island, size indeterminate, position unknown. It was the only option. The engine seized as he crossed the shoreline. The propeller stopped with a mechanical finality that seemed to echo through the airframe. Without power, the Wildcat became a glider with the aerodynamic properties of a brick. Ramsey put it down on a beach. The landing gear collapsed on impact with the soft sand. The aircraft slid, then stopped. He was alive, he was down, and within an hour, Japanese soldiers found him. The initial capture was almost administrative in its efficiency. Ramsey climbed from his wrecked aircraft with his hands raised. The Japanese patrol that found him was small, perhaps 8 men, led by an officer who regarded the downed American pilot with what appeared to be professional detachment. They searched him. They bound his wrists. They marched him inland. The interrogations began that evening. A Japanese officer who spoke passable English asked questions about his carrier, his squadron, the convoy he had been protecting. Ramsey gave only name, rank, and serial number. The officer noted this without apparent frustration and continued asking questions. The beatings came later. Not systematic torture, but punishment for non-compliance, delivered with an almost casual regularity. A rifle butt to the ribs when he refused to answer. An open-handed slap when his responses were deemed insufficient. The violence was purposeful but measured, calibrated to produce information without rendering the prisoner useless. Ramsey understood, from briefings he had received and stories passed among aviators, that the Japanese treatment of prisoners varied enormously based on circumstances, location, and the disposition of individual commanders. Some POWs were treated according to international conventions, many were not. He was transferred multiple times over the following weeks. Each move seemed to take him deeper into Japanese-held territory. He lost track of dates. He lost track of geography. He knew only that he was being held somewhere in the Philippines, in a camp that received prisoners from across the theater. The guards in his final camp operated according to assumptions that had been reinforced by years of experience with American and Allied prisoners. They expected initial resistance followed by gradual compliance. They expected prisoners to form social hierarchies that could be manipulated and exploited. They expected the combination of inadequate food, harsh treatment, and isolation to break the will of even the most determined captives. Most prisoners followed this pattern, not from weakness, but from the rational calculation that survival required some degree of cooperation. Men who resisted too visibly became examples. Men who cooperated too visibly became collaborators, shunned by their fellow prisoners. The space between these extremes was narrow and required careful navigation. Ramsey watched the other prisoners and learned their strategies. Some retreated into themselves, conserving physical and emotional energy for an endurance contest that might last years. Others formed tight groups for mutual support, sharing food and information and the psychological burden of captivity. A few simply gave up, their eyes going hollow, their bodies wasting even faster than the inadequate rations could explain. The guards noticed Ramsey's observation. They did not understand it. To them, he appeared compliant. He followed orders. He ate what he was given. He performed the work details assigned to him. He did not cause trouble. What they did not see was the map he was building in his mind, the patrol schedules he was memorizing, the terrain features he was cataloging during work details outside the camp, the gradual, patient accumulation of information that had no immediate use, but might, under the right circumstances, become invaluable. The assumption of predictability was the guards' greatest vulnerability. They had processed so many prisoners that they believed they understood how captive Americans behaved. They did not account for the possibility that a pilot who had been trained to fly combat missions over hostile territory might bring a different set of mental tools to the problem of survival. Ramsey gave them nothing to question. He was unremarkable, cooperative, broken as far as they could tell. It was exactly what he wanted them to believe. The moment came without warning. Late September 1944, the camp had received news, passed in fragments among the prisoners, that American forces were approaching the Philippines. The invasion was imminent. Liberation was possible. But with that hope came a darker understanding. As American forces advanced, Japanese commanders faced decisions about their prisoners. Transport to Japan was becoming increasingly difficult as American submarines and aircraft interdicted shipping lanes. Keeping large numbers of prisoners required resources that were needed elsewhere. Some camps simply released their prisoners as the front approached. Others did not. The guards' behavior changed. Tension replaced routine. The regular patterns Ramsey had memorized began to shift. Supply deliveries became irregular. Work details were canceled without explanation. The guards themselves seemed uncertain, waiting for orders that might never come. On a morning that began like any other, Ramsey noticed something different. The guards had gathered near the camp's main gate. Their attention was directed outward, toward the jungle trail that led to the nearest Japanese garrison. They were not watching the prisoners. It was the first time since his capture that Ramsey had observed a moment when no guard was specifically monitoring the detention area. He did not move, not yet. He watched, he counted, he calculated. The distraction lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Then a guard turned, swept his gaze across the prisoners, and the moment passed. But Ramsey had seen something important. The guards' attention was not infinite. Their discipline, maintained for years through routine, could be disrupted by uncertainty about their own situation. He filed this away. Not as an escape plan, not yet, just as information. 3 days later, the pattern repeated. This time the guards were distracted by the arrival of a messenger from the garrison. The conversation was animated, urgent. Something had changed. Ramsey did not know what, but he knew that the predictable world of the camp was becoming unpredictable, and unpredictability created opportunities that could not exist under normal conditions. He began preparing. Not obviously, not in ways that could be observed. He started eating every scrap of food he was given, even when his body wanted to reject it. He began exercising in subtle ways, rebuilding strength that months of captivity had eroded. He mentally rehearsed movements he might need to make quickly. He also began communicating with other prisoners, carefully, indirectly, using glances and gestures and the abbreviated code that men develop when open speech is impossible. Not all of them were ready. Some had been broken too thoroughly, some were too weak to move quickly, some simply did not believe that any opportunity would actually present itself. But 3 others responded. Navy men, like himself, men who had been watching the same patterns, men who understood that waiting for liberation might mean waiting too long. They did not discuss plans openly. They did not need to. The understanding was implicit. When the moment came, if it came, they would act. The irrational calculation had already been made. Staying in the camp guaranteed nothing. The approaching invasion might bring liberation, or it might bring execution. The only variable they could control was whether they were present when that determination was made. The silence of those waiting days was terrible. Each morning might be the last in captivity or the last of life. There was no way to know which. Ramsey spent those days in a state of focused calm that he had first learned in the cockpit. The present moment was the only thing he could control. Fear of the future was useless. Regret about the past was equally pointless. He thought about his aircraft, about the procedures he had drilled until they became automatic, about the way a pilot manages uncertainty by focusing on what can be managed. And he waited. The reversal came on October 20th, 1944. American forces landed on Leyte. The invasion of the Philippines had begun. The camp's guards received orders that Ramsey and the other prisoners never saw, but the effects were visible immediately. The guards began packing equipment. They began destroying documents. They began behaving as men do when they expect to abandon a position. And then, late in the afternoon, most of them left, not all. A skeleton force remained to guard the prisoners, perhaps a dozen men where there had been 30. But the routine had collapsed. The attention that had maintained control was now directed toward personal survival. That evening, the remaining guards gathered to discuss something. Their voices carried across the camp, urgent and contentious. Whatever they were debating, it occupied their complete attention. Ramsey looked at the 3 men who had been watching with him. No signal was necessary. They moved. The bamboo cage that had held Ramsey for weeks was not locked in the conventional sense. It was secured with rope and wooden pegs, designed to hold prisoners who had been starved into passivity. Ramsey had tested the structure carefully during his captivity. He knew which joints were weakest. He twisted against the bamboo slats, using leverage rather than strength. The first joint gave way with a crack that seemed impossibly loud. But the guards did not react. Their argument continued. The second joint, the third. A gap opened in the cage wall, just large enough for a man who had lost perhaps 30 pounds to slide through. He was out. The others followed, using different routes, different methods. One had been working at the wooden floor of his cage for days, scraping away material with a fragment of metal concealed in his clothing. Another simply pushed through slats that had rotted in the tropical humidity. They did not run. Running would attract attention. They moved carefully, using the lengthening shadows of evening, staying low, heading toward the jungle that surrounded the camp on 3 sides. The guards noticed their absence perhaps 20 minutes later. By then, Ramsey and the others had reached the tree line. The shouts behind them seemed distant, confused. Whoever was giving orders had lost control of the situation. The escape was not clean. It was not heroic. It was simply 4 men moving through jungle in darkness, without shoes in some cases, without any certainty about where American lines might be. They traveled for 3 days. The jungle was everything they had been told: dense, disorienting, filled with hazards they could not see. They drank from streams they hoped were clean. They ate what they could find that appeared edible. They moved toward the sounds of battle, which meant moving toward danger, but also toward the only people who could help them. Filipino guerrillas found them on the morning of the 4th day. The guerrillas had been fighting the Japanese occupation for years. They knew the terrain. They knew where American forces were advancing. They provided food, water, information, and guides who led Ramsey's group toward the front lines. 2 weeks after the escape, Ramsey crossed into American-controlled territory. He weighed perhaps 120 pounds. He was covered in insect bites. He had an infection in his left leg that would require weeks of treatment to resolve. But he was alive. Of the 4 men who escaped with him, all 4 survived. Not because the escape was perfectly planned, not because they encountered no difficulties, but because they had identified the moment when the assumptions that kept them captive no longer applied, and they had acted before that moment passed. The intelligence value of what Ramsey had observed during his captivity was considerable. His debriefing lasted days. The patrol patterns he had memorized, the supply schedules he had noted, the terrain features he had catalogued during work details, all of it contributed to American understanding of Japanese operations in the region. His survival was not remarkable in isolation. Other prisoners escaped during the Philippine liberation. Many did not. But Ramsey's case demonstrated something that military planners found significant. A trained aviator, with the right temperament and the right attention to detail, could remain operationally functional even under conditions designed to destroy exactly that capability. He had not survived by luck. He had survived by continuing to think when the rational response was to stop thinking entirely. The war ended. Paul Ramsey went home. He returned to Missouri, to the flat horizons and the big sky he had watched as a boy. He did not seek recognition for what he had endured. He did not write memoirs or give speeches or position himself as a survivor with lessons to share. He married. He raised a family. He worked in aviation-related businesses, applying the technical knowledge he had acquired during his Navy service. He lived a quiet life in a country that was rapidly putting the war behind it. Occasionally, when pressed, he would speak about his experiences, never for drama, never for sympathy. His accounts were factual, stripped of emotional embellishment, focused on what happened rather than how he felt about it. He recalled the cage, the dimensions, the way the bamboo felt against his skin, the calculations he performed to determine which joints might give way under pressure. He recalled the escape, the moment of decision, the fact that acting required accepting uncertainty about outcomes, accepting that the jungle might kill them as effectively as the guards. He recalled the Filipino guerrillas, their competence, their courage, the way they moved through terrain that would have defeated the Americans without their guidance. What he did not recall, or did not speak about, was fear. Not because he had not experienced it. Fear was inevitable, but fear, in his framing, was simply another variable to be managed, like fuel consumption or engine temperature. The distinction mattered more than might be immediately apparent. Men who survived captivity had found ways to continue functioning when circumstances exceeded their training. They had refused to accept that helplessness was permanent. They had maintained internal processes, mental activities that preserved their capacity to act when opportunities emerged. Ramsey's training as an aviator had given him tools that transferred to captivity. The cockpit demanded constant attention. It punished pilots who stopped thinking. It rewarded those who continued processing information, even when that information was incomplete, confusing, or frightening. He had never stopped flying, in a sense, even when he was confined to a cage too small to stand in, even when his aircraft was 1,000 miles away. The Navy recorded his experience as one case among thousands: prisoner of war, escaped, returned to duty, honorably discharged. The file contained none of the texture, none of the patience, none of the controlled observation that had made his survival possible. It was just another bureaucratic notation in a war that had produced millions of them. Ramsey would have been fine with that. He had not acted to create a story. He had acted to live. He died decades later in the same part of the country where he had been born. His obituary mentioned his Navy service, his family, his career. It did not mention the cage, the escape, or the weeks of survival in jungle that should have killed him. The lesson of his captivity was not a lesson he articulated. It was simply something he had demonstrated. War does not reward the strongest. It does not reward the bravest. It rewards those who continue thinking when circumstances demand that they stop. The men who survived what Ramsey survived were not special in any way that could be tested or measured or predicted in advance. They were simply the ones who refused to accept that captivity was the end of agency. They were the ones who understood that even a bamboo cage has weak points if you have the patience to find them. Paul Ramsey found his, and he spent the rest of his life in the quiet territory that comes after the war ends and the survivors go home to discover whether the country they fought for still feels like the country they left. For him, it did. The flat horizons were still there, the sky was still big, and the trains still ran, just as they had when his father worked the railroad and a boy watched the grass airstrip and imagined what it might feel like to climb away from the earth and into something larger than himself. He had learned, the sky does not give you anything. It only reveals what you already are. Ramsey was a man who kept thinking. It was enough.